The World War II follow-up to Squad, set to walk hand in hand with Hell Let Loose. Postscriptum is perhaps one of the best examples of a brilliant game that just couldn't quite make it in today's landscape. From beautiful large open maps, horrific gun simulation with arms and armor authentically recreated. What went wrong?
But even more interestingly, how has it come back in the best way possible?
This is the day Postscriptum died. Developed by Periscope, this game offers an immersive experience of what it was like to be on the front lines during one of the most significant events in human history. The game focuses on the historical operation on one-to-one scale maps. Postscriptum was set to be this World War II version of a simulation FPS. Much like its predecessor Squad, you are not a one-man army. You're part of a team. Your survival will depend on how well you work together. And here's the issue. There are over 40 vehicles, 140 weapons, and a variety of roles that you can play, each with their own skill caps and entry levels, and of course, ways that you can improve them as you go along, whether you want to play as a medic, a captain, or anti-tank, learning how to use each weapon in that class and upgrading. One of the standout features for Postscriptum, though, is its commitment to realism, from the uniforms to the weapons to the landscapes, to even the player base that want to get involved. They are working together because that's what the game has orientated them towards. The developers meticulously researched and recreated a World War II experience to make it as authentic as possible. So why then, especially with the success of at least Squad, why did Postscriptum not quite do as well? It still has at least one full server every day, but it's kind of only playable for EU players. There are some US people still playing it, but not nearly as much, and you pretty much are screwed if you live anywhere else in the world. And I think its biggest downfall is its biggest strength: ultra realism. This is something that is lauded over by gamers and has been for quite some time now. Whether it's complaining that a Call of Duty title is too arcadey and Battlefield is better because it's larger scale, neither really hold a candle to the realistic simulations that we have today. Arma 2 and Arma 3 were the closest to the largest scale simulated military shooters that we had, both being meticulously crafted in these huge worlds and trying to be orientated towards the more hardcore gamer types. Then you have something like Insurgency, still going for more realism with very fast time to kills, minimal HUD and no kill feeds, but on a smaller scale, almost trying to bring in that Counter-Strike crowd to go for a realistic look on the genre. And then you have somewhere in the middle, the Battlefield of this title. Whether it's Squad in the modern day or Postscriptum in World War II, they are bringing that middle ground of large scale but not humongous maps like an Arma, but also focusing still on that first person individuality and combat whilst bringing in team play, working together with squads, commanders, and of course your arms and armor with sniper support. But to really look at why Postscriptum didn't do quite as well, I think it's a good idea to have a look at what titles did do well in the same vein. Most notably Hell Let Loose. It has been very successful, and despite its recent drama with the developers and the somewhat downward trough of the title's roadmap, Hell Let Loose has been great, and its player base is still there. And I think it's completely down to this: it isn't quite as realistic. It doesn't have that sheer dedication to simulation like Postscriptum does, and that's probably a negative thing for a lot of people, but because of this, it means the learning curve from an arcade shooter, which, remember, are still the mainstream, like Call of Duty or Battlefield, isn't as big when it comes to jumping into a title like Hell Let Loose. Don't get me wrong, there is still a big orientation that needs to be done to understand how that title works, but the developers have done a good job of making it realistic enough so it appeases that simulation crowd, but also not too daunting for new players to get their hold on. And with that massive array of content coming out, it keeps it varied. But because of Postscriptum's huge implementation of realism, the learning curve is way more. Hell Let Loose, you don't actually have to speak that much. Of course, it's preferred, and snobby people might say you shouldn't be playing unless you're communicating, but you can get away with it. You can still have a great time and still enjoy the core mechanics of Hell Let Loose, even if you're just on your own. Postscriptum is a very different story. It's almost imperative to communicate with your team, whether it's talking, typing, or of course following orders. And a lot of people just aren't up to that in a multiplayer shooter. More casual gamers want to hop on and hop off. And with vastly longer game times, that doesn't give Postscriptum the fair shake it deserves. Sometimes its biggest strength, in this case, its dedication to realism, is also its biggest weakness. But we're here talking about the day Postscriptum died, the day everything shut down for the title. And I think for me and most, that would have been December of 2022. It was rumored that the developers were completely laid off, that there will be no one else working on the title from this point forward, and that seems to come into fruition. There is no more updates, only mods will be coming out and anything community made. They also had a little bit of a setback with a game like Beyond the Wire, their World War I variant on their Postscriptum and Squad realism, and that didn't do too well either, dying almost instantly. They are still, as far as I know, putting some time and money into developing that title with new updates, but Postscriptum has been out for too long. I think it's just been a little bit too much for them to want to carry it on.
Until now. You see, this whole video has been summing up the death of Postscriptum, but it is finally back in its own and new form. Offworld Industries, the publishers and developers for Squad, that were the publishers for Postscriptum and Beyond the Wire, have swooped in, creating their own franchise of Squad games. Postscriptum and its IP was bought up and renamed Squad 44, a new World War II FPS off the bones of Postscriptum, completely changing it and bringing in its audience. Everybody started to come back, sways of new players came in, and it looked like it was surviving. It looked like something else was on its way. 6 months go by and players started to drop. There were no new updates. We just had promises that these guys were going to do something else with what Postscriptum couldn't. Then finally, in the last few weeks, we got Reign of Steel. A whole new overhaul to the game, with new graphics, lighting, maps, a whole new game mode being the front line, and of course, 40 new vehicles, whether it's tanks, light artillery weapons, rocket artillery, and of course, so many more mechanics and abilities. They've completely overhauled the way the game was, and players started to flood back in. The game of Postscriptum was left dead in the dirt by its previous developers Periscope, but Offworld Industries decided they didn't want to just publish a dead game anymore, they wanted to try and fix it. Because of the resources and the success they've had from Squad, I think it was the perfect idea. They have a franchise set and ready to go, and if I'm going to be honest, I think we could be seeing a similar thing with Beyond the Wire in the future. You see, that game didn't exactly go all too well, and Offworld Industries will be very aware of it. It came, it saw, and it definitely didn't conquer. Once again, like Postscriptum, didn't quite get the player base that they really wanted it to. It didn't quite hit the mark, and I think they're going to be reviving it as well in the future by buying up, probably calling it Squad 1914, and we're going to be getting a whole franchise at this point. Squad 44 has a bright future now. It still is nowhere near the levels and the heights of what Hell Let Loose was, but there is at least hope. The player base is growing, and of course, the sentiment towards the title. Its ex-developers have moved across, now having stronger and better resources behind them, and a roadmap of a future. More game modes, more factions coming in, and of course, new maps and content to keep people updated. In 6 months, they've managed to turn around what the past Periscope games were working on for Postscriptum and bring it into fruition in one of the greatest updates that we've seen in a World War II FPS in a long, long time. And this can only be a good sign for the future, and I, for one, cannot wait to see what happens. So there might have been a day that Postscriptum died, but from the ashes of that, Squad 44 was born again. And boy, am I so excited to see what the future holds.